Hello everyone. I wanted to put together this piece to follow up on some of the things that I wrote about the Iran war before we went to South by Southwest and we got so busy with that. So I'll go on and just start right into it. So I've titled this, and the date is April 9th, 2026. I titled it, Who Wins a War? And we have certainly seen some geopolitical theatrics over the past few weeks. After President Trump threatened to completely annihilate the country and the people of Iran, on Tuesday evening, April 7th, he announced that the war was on pause. 2 weeks ago, the Trump administration had sent Iran a 15-point proposal on ending the war. Because of the condition of the Iranian government and difficulty in determining who is actually making decisions for the entire nation over there, we don't know who might have read that proposal and considered its points. In any case, earlier this week, Iran apparently sent their proposal to the USA on ending the war. Then Iran's news agency released a copy of what it said was their 10-point proposal. But then the White House said that they received a different proposal. However, it was on this basis of receiving any proposal, not the one in the press, and not based on the content of what the proposal said, that Trump officially paused the war and a tenuous ceasefire began. So, annihilation is now on hold for the next 2 weeks to give the two sides a chance to iron out their differences and scale down the conflict. So let's look at the 10 points of Iran's peace proposal that was released publicly. This is what came out in the Iranian news agency. Number 1, a guarantee of no further U.S. attacks against Iran. Number 2, Iran maintains control of the Strait of Hormuz. Number 3, ending the regional war on all fronts, including against Hezbollah in Lebanon. Number 4, withdrawal of U.S. combat forces from all bases and positions in the region. Number 5, reparations to Iran for war damages. Number 6, acceptance of Iran's right to nuclear enrichment. Number 7, lifting all primary sanctions on Iran. Number 8, lifting all secondary sanctions on Iran. Number 9, termination of all resolutions against Iran by the Board of Governors of the International Atomic Energy Agency. And number 10, termination of all United Nations Security Council resolutions against Iran. So if you read that carefully, if you listened carefully, it doesn't look like an acknowledgement that the USA and Israel have won the war. It looks like Iran still has a lot of leverage, and they are demanding that the USA not only back off, but completely leave the area and pay them war reparations. In addition, if the primary goal of the war was to completely dismantle Iran's nuclear program, there's absolutely nothing in this proposal that indicates Iran has even budged an inch on this demand. If Iran was really a defeated power, and they just wanted the American military to stop killing their soldiers and stop destroying their infrastructure, the proposal would look drastically different. You would be hearing them say, "Please stop, we'll do what you say." That's not the messaging that's coming from Iran. Instead, it is still defiant. Iran's proposal reads like a victory proposal in which they, not America and Israel, are demanding terms to end the war. And the additional goal of the war, which was regime change, well, that also seems to have failed, or at least it hasn't even gotten started. If there was any indication that there was a rising civilian power in Iran actually threatening the rule of the IRGC, you would be hearing about it. You would be hearing reports about it in all of the major news outlets. Mainstream media may not like the Trump administration, and they may skew the news to try and make him look bad, but they would not completely ignore a reality that is happening on the ground if it is actually there. And if you're only listening to this and you don't know what the IRGC is, that is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is basically the internal military of Iran that they use to suppress the people and to maintain the Islamic Revolution hold on power. So this IRGC, along with the Basij, make up the internal security apparatus of Iran. And the internal security apparatus of Iran apparently remains as strong as it was before the war started. The massive nationwide protests across over 100 cities in Iran back in January was so severely repressed, with tens of thousands killed by the regime, that it seems there is no will among the population to rise up against their government. The IRGC and the Basij, who enforced the crackdown, have not fractured and remain as defiant as ever against the USA. There are no reports of military defections, which would be a key component for a revolutionary uprising to take root and succeed. So what have been the effects of the war? Here are some of the things I've observed, and I'm not making judgments on this, just observing the facts. The Iranian leadership from before the war was killed off, allowing a new crop of leaders to come to power. The IRGC and the Basij remain in control, solidifying their grip on the entire country, and are able to solidly deter any uprising through severe repressive measures. Iranian offensive weapons, as in missiles and drones, have been destroyed by the thousands. We do not know how effective the destruction of production factories for the Shahed drones and other missiles has been. As far as we know, Iranian offensive missile capability against Israel has been significantly degraded for the time being. We do not know what their capability will be to rebuild a missile arsenal, and we have no evidence that the material support and resupply efforts by China and Russia have been degraded. The war was begun while an American team was involved in active negotiations for peace with an Iranian delegation. This signals to America's enemies that American-led negotiations will never be trustworthy and could likely be considered a ruse to distract them before hostilities begin. The enriched uranium fuel, which Iran had, which was buried beneath rubble by bunker buster bombs back last June, remains unaccounted for. The Strait of Hormuz has closed, sending oil prices significantly higher, putting stress on global trade relationships. Iran laid sea mines in the strait. Those sea mines are still there. Maritime insurance agencies don't want to insure ships passing through the strait, which significantly raises the cost and reliability of shipping of any products coming out of that region. Iran fully controls the strait now, requiring a payment for permission to transit, whereas before the war it was free passage. Based on various news reports in April so far, maritime reporting agencies said that 11 ships passed through the Strait of Hormuz on April 7th and April 8th. And then on April 9th, there were 7 ships. That was the first day of the ceasefire. So on the very first day of the ceasefire, only 7 ships passed through the Strait of Hormuz. This is compared to a pre-war average of around 130 ships per day transiting the strait. Another point, petrochemical refineries and infrastructure all throughout the Middle East region have been damaged and taken offline. This has had a significant effect on the many products that depend on them, including oil, natural gas, gasoline, LNG, helium, ammonia, fertilizers, and others. In particular, the impact on liquefied natural gas is as follows. Qatar's Ras Laffan refinery was damaged, taking 20% of global LNG production offline. 20%. LNG is critical for Europe and South Asia's energy needs. Fertilizer shortages are likely to have an impact on global food supply over the next year, and maybe even into the following year. And on April 9th, the day I started writing this, yesterday, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian, after the supposed peace proposal negotiations started, said that Israeli strikes on Lebanon would render negotiations meaningless. Those are just a few of the facts. So here's what the situation looks like to me. President Trump was hoping that an attack on Iran, because of the overwhelming firepower of the US military, would quickly topple the Iranian government and cause a civilian uprising. There are 2 factors internal to Iran that it seems he or people in his administration didn't consider. First is the violent suppression of the protests in January before the war, which killed anywhere from 15,000 to 30,000 Iranians, likely scared the remaining Iranian people so badly that they have no fight left in them. They have not risen up against their own government as a result of this war. Second, the IRGC is so deeply embedded in all aspects of Iranian social, civilian, and economic life that the act of killing off the leaders of the government would not have the effect of causing its collapse. The IRGC has been preparing for this kind of attack for years, and that is why they embedded themselves the way they did. There is no reason now to believe that the Iranian people are going to rise up and topple the IRGC or their government, especially now that a supposed ceasefire and negotiations have begun. This seems to have been a huge systemic and strategic failure on the part of the Trump administration when they were choosing to decide whether or not to initiate the war. Very significant. Now, in addition to the above, with the resupply lines for armaments and munitions for Iran coming from Russia and China, we can expect that Iran will be able to rearm and make more Shahed drones and make more missiles over time, just like they did from last June until the start of this war. They also now have complete control of the Strait of Hormuz, and all of their adversaries in the region are economically crippled due to attacks on refineries. So even if the Strait of Hormuz is able to be reopened, the oil is not coming back right away. And with the price of oil staying elevated, though it is not all the way up to 120 anymore, it could go there over time. And just to note that the initial spike in the price was a reactionary market event. That kind of thing happens. So if the ceasefire holds, the price could go up slowly on account of the significant reduction in supply, or it will, most likely will. If the ceasefire fails and the war restarts, the price will likely spike again. Regardless, the damaged infrastructure of not only in Iran, but in all the other countries, will take years to rebuild. The fundamentals are in place for a rise in energy prices until these things work their way through the market. And this is likely to cause a slowdown in economic activity over the entire world over the next several months to perhaps a couple of years. Now, eventually, this could result in a massive fall in energy prices, as happens in most economic slowdowns. But for now, energy prices are set to continue higher. And just a little bit on that, I just want to bring us back to a reminder. You might remember at the beginning of the pandemic, when it was in the news that the price of a barrel of oil went negative for a short bit. I remember seeing it on the news all over the place. That was because economic activity had stopped as everyone went home. Nobody needed oil because all of the factories were shut down, and nobody was driving anywhere. Anytime there's an economic slowdown, one of the effects is a drop in the price of oil because of what is called demand destruction. Factories that couldn't afford to purchase the energy at the higher prices ended up closing their doors. The workers in those factories ended up going home, as they will in this case. If we have a severe economic slowdown, factories will shut down, workers in those factories might go home, manufacturing centers or businesses, whatever it might be, they won't get paid because the business has nothing to pay them. Maybe they go back to some provincial area in their home country or some rural area in this country. They go back, they plant gardens for food and begin doing what humans do in order to figure out how to survive. That's what happens in a severe economic slowdown, also known as a depression. So even though economic effects will start out with what looks like inflation, with energy prices rising, the longer term effect will be to slow down the economy and even bring some parts of the economy to a complete halt. So here's the way I see the economic sequence of events playing out, assuming that things play out on a massive scale, which all indications are that they will. Either a slow or rapid rise in the price of oil, we don't know which yet, but one of the two. It's going up regardless. Either a slow or rapid rise in the price of oil due to this war causes a scramble for dollars in international markets. as companies look to try and keep their factories going. And the reason for that, of course, is they need dollars. Dollars is the primary international currency. So they need dollars to pay their bills, pay off loans, to make international debt obligations, all these different things. So as people scramble for dollars, they do whatever they can to find dollars. This causes the strength of the dollar to go up because everyone is buying dollars. So dollar strength compared to other currencies goes up, and that means that more dollar denominated assets like US stocks and treasury bonds end up getting sold off more as people that hold those assets need more dollars. So the reason those get sold off is the owners of stocks and treasury bonds, need the dollars to buy the more expensive energy, to pay debt, and to try and keep their businesses going. Many of the sellers are foreigners, as there are huge numbers of foreigners that own both US stocks and treasury bonds. And you can see from this graphic that I posted here, if you're watching the video, the rest of the world shows the rest of the world's ownership in US stocks. And that's just US stocks. There's another, it's kind of a similar or equivalent level in US bonds. Just US stocks, the rest of the world, foreigners own $15 trillion of US stocks. That's around 25 to 30% of the overall market. So even if half of that gets sold off, it's going to cause a very significant market event. So as and the same thing would happen with US Treasury bonds. And as US Treasury bonds sell off, US interest rates will rise, making it very difficult for the US government to continue to finance its debt. US government debt is deeply integrated into the functioning of the world economy. As US stocks sell off, US tax receipts will fall because they are directly correlated to the value of the stock market, making the problem worse. The only way to save the Treasury market at that point and prevent the system from collapsing will be if the Federal Reserve not only cuts short-term interest rates, but caps long-term interest rates by purchasing US Treasury bonds with printed money. This is the reason why the Trump administration had been pushing for the Fed to cut interest rates late last year. They were seeing that there is likely to be a coming economic crisis, which will hit us hard, and they wanted to force cuts rather than wait until the crisis gets here when it may be too late. If they would have cut rates at the beginning of the year instead of worrying about inflation, it might have been enough to induce economic activity strong enough to overcome the condition we are about to face. And of course, it would have been inflationary. That's the reason they didn't cut, is because they are concerned about inflation. But inflation is only a problem when it is inflation without economic growth. If there's economic growth alongside inflation, and that economic growth is stronger than the inflation, goods and services may get more expensive, but most people still have the means to sustain themselves because of the growth. And of course, when I say that it's only a problem without economic growth, I'm talking about in a crisis environment. In a normal environment, like we've experienced for the last 50 years, continuous growth and inflation does cause problems in that it exacerbates wealth inequality. But that's a bit of a digression, so we'll go back to this. So, by waiting to cut rates, so by the Federal Reserve waiting to cut rates instead of cutting early, we are now facing inflation without economic growth, which will eventually reverse itself into a severe deflationary environment. That is the point where recession or depression sets in. The perfect economic storm happens if the price of oil rises at such a pace that at first it causes a sell-off in US Treasury bonds and US stocks. Then it stays elevated long enough to induce manufacturing shutdowns all over the globe. Trade will slow down significantly as economic growth stagnates with rising energy prices. Sell-off in US Treasuries and US stocks will make it very difficult for the US government to get financing for its operations. Rising energy prices will also cause a rise in fertilizer prices, especially nitrogen fertilizer, a petrochemical byproduct. This is a primary ingredient for corn, which is not only a food staple, but it is also a feedstock ingredient for many of the packaged foods that we all consume. It will also affect the other main staple crops, rice, wheat, soybeans, all of them. So we're looking at potentially significant inflation in food prices in the coming months. Now, with oil and gas prices soaring, there will be a drive to push harder into other sources of energy, such as nuclear and solar. In order to facilitate this transition, we need to produce tons of copper and other industrial metals. Yet producing these metals will be problematic. Without copper, nickel, and uranium, this transition will only go in fits and starts. And then on top of this, there is the need for data centers, which would not only facilitate economic growth and help prevent the economic disinflation or economic deflation from having its most severe effects, but the data centers, it helps because it helps businesses and consumers to remain competitive. So we have this need for data centers. However, the ability to build out data centers will be stifled, not because of the lack of funds, but on account of the lack of materials available to physically build the electrical infrastructure needed for the transition. We need copper, nickel, steel, aluminum, uranium, and other industrial metals. So it makes you ask the question, why don't we just produce more of these metals? Especially copper, nickel, and uranium, the ones we need the most. Why not just ride over the regulations that get in the way, elect people that will be willing to put them aside temporarily, and build more production plants and dig more mines? We have the resources for those materials in the ground in North America and can also get a lot of the ore from friendly countries. Well, all three of these critical metals, these metals that are critical for building out the electric grid, depend not only on burning fuel to have the energy for their production, but also on sulfuric acid as a reagent in the metallurgical process. Okay, sulfuric acid. Did you expect to hear that? How does sulfuric acid come into play? Where does sulfuric acid come from? Sulfuric acid is made in acid plants from raw sulfur. Raw sulfur is shipped all over the world in bulk because it is safer to ship raw sulfur than to make the acid and ship the acid. And where does raw sulfur come from? It is a byproduct of processing what we call sour crude into usable fuels. This sulfuric acid is a critical component. I want to emphasize this. We can't make the copper and the nickel and the uranium and even the silver, which is both monetary and industrial qualities. We can't produce those materials at scale without sulfuric acid. This one element, or it's not an element, this one compound, that we can't produce it without it. And that is very, very dependent on sour crude. So let's talk about sulfur and its connection to global energy markets. First, let me just explain a little bit. What is sour crude? There are many different grades of crude oil, and sour crude is one of the ones that most of America's refineries are designed to process. Where does it come from, being the primary source of sulfur? Well, primarily from the Middle East, and most of it passes through the Strait of Hormuz. There are other sources, thankfully, such as the Canadian oil sands, but that's being held back from export by the environmental lobby's influence on the Canadian government over the past several years, past couple of decades at least. There's also sour crude sourced from both Mexico and Venezuela. Both of those have serious obstacles to getting the sour crude to U.S. refineries. Mexico has a challenge in that a cartel controls one of the areas their pipelines pass through, and the cartel members have been siphoning off much of what's in the pipeline to sell it for their own profits. Mexico is working to take out the cartel that's been stealing oil and gasoline and anything else, but that will take considerable time. Venezuela has some of the largest reserves in the world, and they will eventually be able to begin supplying large volumes of sour crude again. But that also will take time. It's not going to happen in the next few months. It'll take a few years. It'll take time for those oil fields to be redeveloped because they were so mismanaged under Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro's leftist governments. So we've got a loss of sour crude imports. The loss of sour crude imports from the Persian Gulf means a reduction in sulfur production, leading to a reduction in sulfuric acid production, leading to a reduction in copper, nickel, and uranium production, and silver production, leading to longer lead times in what is already a very delayed process to building out the US electric grid. And add onto this the current political backlash in local communities to building new data centers all over the country, and things look even slower. And in the meantime, China has already built out much of their electric grid. They are not stifled by an environmental lobby. They already have significant competitors in AI to the American AI companies. If American data centers can't be built on account of not having a strong enough electric grid, American AI companies are going to lose the competition to China because China's grid is robust and growing. Then, when the economic recovery finally begins to happen, at that point, Chinese AI companies will have already surpassed American AI companies. The world will look to China instead of America for implementing AI processes as part of the necessary means to bring back economic growth. And China will become the new global hegemon as America fades into the background. In so doing, China will be able to export not only their economics, but their political philosophies of Maoism, Marxism, authoritarianism, and communism, along with those associated complete lack of ethics. And they'll be able to export those ideas all over the globe. Christian missions will come increasingly under scrutiny, as those authoritarian systems always look with suspicion on Christian activity. And as far as the effects of rising oil prices on China, they will be somewhat insulated for several months on account of their huge strategic petroleum reserve, which is full at the moment. America also has a strategic petroleum reserve, but the Biden administration unnecessarily depleted it 3 years ago, and our government has only partially been able to refill it since then. We don't have the cushion that China has. Not only that, China controls rare earths, the necessary materials to produce the magnets that our military needs for so many things, especially missiles. Since we have used up most of our stock of missile defenses in fighting Iran on the other side of the world, having pulled missile defensive systems out of South Korea and Japan in order to do so, China's extra-large military footprint in the Asia-Pacific region is, by comparison, growing even stronger and larger. It is possible that every country in the entire region could pivot to becoming vassal states of China over the next 5 years and forsake their relationships with the United States. If this does happen, it won't happen because of sentiment, as many of those countries are still pro-American. It will happen because they will realize it is necessary for their survival. The United States will not be able to rearm on account of they basically need China's permission, meaning the sale of rare earths to the USA, and hence the United States will not be able to defend Taiwan, the Philippines, Japan, South Korea, or any other country in that region. All of those countries will be subject to bullying from China. And after all, why would China sell rare earths to America if it knew that America was just going to use those rare earths to build up weapon systems to fight China? So this brings up the question, what will happen to Israel? Now for this question, I'll just have to hold on to that question for another essay, as it delves deeply into the religious ideas of many people and how those religious ideas are affecting geopolitics. The only thing I will point out here is that we have re-entered an era where religion is playing a role on the international stage in a much more prominent way once again, as it has through most of human history. The secularists of the past 80 years would say the solution is for the majority of the world to become non-religious. Of course, that is an absurd proposition, and it will never happen. Human beings are religious by nature, and this cannot be forced out of them, as much as Mao and the Chinese communists have tried to do for decades. Neither can it be educated out of them, as Western secularists pushing modernist ideas in schools have tried and failed to do for decades. It is far better to just understand religious differences, just as we understand other areas of discipline study, and then develop frameworks for understanding each other so that we minimize conflict. Ultimately, when it comes to the war, the winner of the war is the one who dictates the terms. Even though tactically the USA has completely dominated Iran, we are very, very far from a strategic victory. So far, Donald Trump has backed down on threats and indicated that he's ready to compromise on certain terms. On the other hand, Iran hasn't backed down on hardly any of the terms, and their primary point of leverage is the Strait of Hormuz. They may end up compromising on some areas, but if they retain full control of Hormuz when they didn't have control of it before the war, that will indicate that regardless of the headlines, they are the strategic winners in this war. Of course, eventually things are going to shift around. Iran's neighbors will have a say if Iran tries to control the Strait of Hormuz unilaterally. They'll do things like build new pipelines and infrastructure to ship their oil out, in some ways able to bypass the strait. And also, other oil fields around the globe will be developed. Other energy sources, despite the difficulties in building them, will eventually become more established. In 5 or 10 years, the Strait of Hormuz may not have nearly as much global significance as it does now. But all of those things will depend on the world figuring out how to overcome the economic difficulties caused by this war. Kind of coming to the end here, I can't think of any reasonable American that would be happy with an outcome of seeing Iran come out ahead at the end of this war and still being able to build nuclear weapons. Even most of Trump's political opponents, for the most part, don't want that to be the result, even though it would be a major strategic defeat for Trump, which would make them happy. But as unpleasant as the idea of an Iran win is, a strategic win, reality dictates that we must consider it as one of the possible outcomes that may happen. After all, if you are like me, we don't have an effect on policy decision makers. We are just observers. We have to prepare for what's coming. But in general, we can't affect it except by normal democratic means, such as voting, writing your representative, and living life as a good citizen. Regardless, it does not affect my hope and my outlook on life. God is still God, and He's still a loving Heavenly Father. We're still made in His image, and we still have a relationship with Him through Christ. And He's still sovereign over the affairs of nations in this world, so we have no reason to despair. We have a responsibility to do our part and to keep the faith, but there's no reason to become despondent. Promises of God are certain and true for those who believe. So let us not lose hope, no matter what the outcome. So after reading through my essay, again, I feel like it might leave some people with a sense of gloom and despair, and I don't want to leave people with that, because I certainly don't have that, even though I believe that we're in for some rough times ahead. But I'm not approaching this with despair and despondency. I believe that we still have hope, and especially us as believers and followers of Christ. If we understand things well, that helps us to have our focus correct. That helps us to put our hope in the right object and be a light to the people around us. And I want to emphasize, there are going to be unbelieving friends, family, neighbors around us that are going to look and see if we are handling the rough times that are ahead, if we are handling that with grace, and if we are resilient and we're shining the light of Christ in that. So I encourage everyone to do that, to make sure that your hope is centered correctly. I would definitely say be prepared in whatever manner you understand is the right way to be prepared. And then I would ask also, stay tuned, because we will be putting out more information as things develop. Thank you, and God bless.